first off, let's go ahead and talk about Jon Jones and the circus on Twitter that happened recently this week. So for those of you that have missed it, Jon Jones has vacated the light heavyweight belt. That will now be determined in a fight between Dominic Reyes and Jan Blachowicz. I forget the exact pay-per-view that it's scheduled for, but that's going to be for the undisputed light heavyweight belt. For the first time in, I believe, 11 years, we're going to have a new champion not named Jon Jones or Daniel Cormier. So that's kind of exciting. It's pretty crazy. But Jon took to Twitter and said that he couldn't come to negotiations with the UFC, so he's vacating the belt. He's going to pursue other things, wished everyone well, all of that, and essentially made it sound like he was retiring. As it turns out, 20 minutes later, he got back on Twitter and said, hey, had a great conversation with the UFC, and I'm going to be moving up to heavyweight, so look for that to happen. So what exactly happened here? Well, a couple of things. So for those of you that, again, haven't been following the Jon Jones saga in recent months, he's been pretty outspoken about not getting paid what he believed is fair, especially when it comes to facing contenders like Jan Blachowicz or a rematch with Reyes that he kind of deems not beneath him per se, but doesn't see much reward in terms of adding to his legacy for either fight. And he's been defending the belt for, when he hasn't had legal issues or USADA issues, has been defending the belt pretty much nonstop, undefeated in the octagon. So when you're looking at this whole situation, from Jon's point of view, it doesn't make sense for him to not get compensated fairly because, again, if he goes out and he beats Reyes again, or he beats Blachowicz, 3 or 4 years down the line, when somebody's looking over his resume, they're not going to look at that and say, oh, wow, he just, went through killers upon killers. I mean, it could be if Reyes ends up being a really dominant champion or Blachowicz and ends up looking amazing, that could be the case, but it's most likely not going to happen for him. So with this fighter pay issue that we've seen also in other cases with Masvidal and other people like that, he's feels that he hasn't been compensated fairly for his past title fights, and at this point feels like it's not worth it. So what happens within the 20 minutes of him saying all that to where he said, I had a great combo with the UFC, I'm moving up to heavyweight? Well, as much as people love to say, champ status is a great thing for the brand, it's a great thing for, the promotion as well as the fighter, it enables these super fights that just brings in tons of money. That's not always the case. So a couple things about champ status that's happened with now Daniel Cormier, Conor McGregor, Amanda Nunes. Almost happened with Dillashaw, but he couldn't get it done. There are others who have failed as well, but those are the three names that come to mind when you think of champs, obviously, for the UFC. When you're looking at that, remember that that's holding up two divisions because it's one person defending two belts. So if they're going to actually defend both belts, that means that the UFC can't book as many pay-per-views as they may like. If you've paid attention to the UFC's booking schedule, I think the only time where it's been scheduled since in 2016 where the main event was not a title fight was Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 2. Other than that, it's always had a scheduled title fight in the main event. I know there's situations like UFC 234 where Anderson Silva and Israel Adesanya got bumped up because Robert Whittaker fell out last minute. Things like that have happened. But for the most part, they always book title fights in the main event. Whether that's because they've got their own metrics and research that say, hey, title fights make way more money in terms of the casual viewer buying a pay-per-view, or it's some contractual obligations they have either with their broadcast partner, ESPN, or the fighters, because generally fighters sign a contract and then have a championship clause in that contract that is activated when they first become champion. They then go on to subsequently sign championship as contracts, but there's no telling what that language exactly says. It's a little bit of an X factor there. Same with the broadcast partnership. It's very possible ESPN said, hey, we need you to have title fights in all your main events. And if you don't, you need to sign off with us first. And there has to be a legitimate reason, yada, yada, yada. It's really hard to say. But either way, if you take away one belt, because let's say DC is going to defend both the light heavyweight and heavyweight belts. For your scheduling, that really messes things up. Because remember, the UFC is also, in general, I know we're in crazy times because of the pandemic, but in general, is booking out their schedule usually a quarter or two ahead at the time, and they're negotiating pretty much all year to get the venues lined up, to make sure they have title fights in place, to make sure everybody gets their fulfilled number of fights on their contract, because they have to offer so many fights per to a fighter per contract term. So they've got to, kind of do the math to situate everything like, oh, okay, I'm fulfilling my obligation from a promotional standpoint of offering these fights to fighters, and I also need headliners to be pay-per-view. That's a lot of logistics, and especially with matchmaking with Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard, that's a lot of logistics to coordinate all at one time. So when you have someone that is a double champion that insists on defending both belts, it causes kind of a headache for the promotion. Yes, it was good for Conor McGregor. It elevated the sport, brought more eyes to the UFC, probably arguably than anything else. It was good for Nunes. It brought legitimacy to her title reigns. Fighting Cyborg, that fight, and beating Cyborg, great for the women's division, great for Amanda Nunes, great for the brand. DC didn't work out, I don't think, the way they wanted it to, not even because he lost to Stipe the following two times, but simply because the pay-per-view buys for their original super fight, UFC 226, were in the 200, 300 range. So nothing, not outside of, and that's 1,000, by the way, 200, 300,000 range. Not, a record-shattering pay-per-view, or even a Jon Jones-esque pay-per-view under normal circumstances of 700K, things like that. So that didn't really, work for them the way they wanted. And he eventually had to drop the light heavyweight belt so he could rematch Stipe after defending the heavyweight belt against Derek Lewis. So it really becomes a pain for the promotion from a logistics standpoint and from a risk-reward standpoint, right? If Jon Jones is a 2-weight champion, DC is a 2-weight champion, it doesn't matter who, and is injured, it sets up, injured at any point, it sets up this scenario where, yes, you can have someone fight for either the interim belt, or you could say it's the undisputed, make that person drop the belt. But it's in the eyes of the fans and the eyes of the media, they're always going to be, well, are they really the champ? Yes. Look at a great example is the situation with Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway, right? Dustin beats Max, wins the interim lightweight championship. As much as people were, saying, yeah, Dustin's finally got a belt and all that, there were a lot of people saying, well, he hasn't beaten Khabib, he hasn't beaten Khabib. So is he really the champ? And, that's not taking anything away from Dustin or his run. It was phenomenal. But from a marketing and brand standpoint, putting that interim there, even though it helps, it also doesn't give the same feel as this person is now the undisputed belt holder. So it's kind of a risk for the promotion, unless Jones is going to go on a tear and fight constantly, defend both belts constantly, and that can elevate him even more. And honestly, it's going to be hard for him to do that because he's already been in the public eye for the UFC for so long. That's, he's kind of a mature star, right? If you're looking at this from a star standpoint, this isn't a new up and comer this isn't Israel Adesanya, who has stormed the scene, has won the middleweight belt, is defending it, did it in such a speedy fashion, and is a new face that if he goes up to light heavyweight and wins, he's 2-belt holder, they can ride that fame. And they can, that really elevates the brand. This is someone that's been around for a long time. And while they can get a small boost from it, we're not talking the same exponential growth that a new face would do at this point, because Jon Jones has been around for so long and because some of his past history. So from a risk standpoint for the UFC, it probably didn't make sense for them to compensate Jones as much for a move up to heavyweight as it did with the belt than it did without. Because now they get to free up that belt. They get to schedule a light heavyweight undisputed title fight, and that takes care of a pay-per-view main event or co-main if they want to add it onto some of these super cards. But either way, takes care of that end. And then, it's still now arguably the greatest of all time, fighting for a belt, pound for pound greatest of all time, fighting for a belt in a new weight class and a new challenger in not only a new weight class, a weight class that's really devoid of a lot of contenders. You have Curtis Blades, but he's lost twice to Francis Ngannou. You have Derek Lewis, but he's not too long ago got knocked out by Junior Dos Santos, and he's had some struggles when you hit that upper tier of the division. Then you have Francis Ngannou, who has roared back since his loss against Stipe, and Derek Lewis, which was, we all remember that fight. That rematch, should it happen, I think would go very differently. But either way, he's really the only clear-cut, okay, this is a contender at heavyweight. This is someone who makes a lot of sense for Stipe right now. So other than that, you're kind of left with a lot of people who are older, wins and losses, named staples of the division. But again, they've been around forever and they've kind of had middling records. They haven't been able to break into a contendership. So adding Jones in there adds new lifeblood, is a big name, gets eyes on the heavyweight division at a time when now Stipe is being viewed as the heavyweight greatest of all time because of his run and being able to beat DC twice. So that kind of sets up some more mystique and gives the heavyweight division more life, without any of the risk of, he's got to go back down and defend his light heavyweight belt, or, if he gets injured, we not only do we lose a title fight at heavyweight, we lose a title fight at light heavyweight. Makes more sense for them to be willing to compensate Jones a little bit more because their risk is now reduced. When their risk is higher, they're always going to use that as leverage and say, hey, like, we can't really do this because you've got the light heavyweight belt. I'm sure that was brought up in negotiations that said, hey, you've got the light heavyweight belt. We need to pay you a little bit less because what if you get injured, all of that. Now they can't fall back on that leverage. So that's pretty much what happened and what I believe to have happened in those negotiations. I think that I think this is going to be the end of the era of the double champ. You may see it in some of these lighter divisions. If Garbrandt goes down and beats Figueiredo, maybe he goes back up and challenges for the bantamweight belt. I could see them trying to push that with Nunes and the state of women's featherweight. Unless they start signing women's featherweights, I think you'll have double champs in that arena. But for the most part, I think this is the end of the double champ era. I think this kind of signifies that, the fact that suddenly within 20 minutes of dropping the light heavyweight belt, Jones gets a productive conversation with the UFC done. And I think that it goes to show again, UFC is always managing their risk reward ratios. It's always about the numbers. Nothing else really changed, at least in the public perception, unless something crazy happened behind the scenes we don't know about. Nothing really changed in those 20 minutes of, I can't come to negotiations, to we've got a potential deal done, other than Jones dropping the belt. So I think that in itself tells a lot. I don't think it's so much, we got to keep Jones here because he wouldn't have been able to fight anywhere else regardless, because of the way the contracts work. So I think that's pretty much what you're seeing here, and why Jones is now fighting at heavyweight, and why the UFC made the deal that it did.